Hello, I'm Scott Crook, and welcome to my family's Treehouse. As those of you who share my surname know, it stands out. It's a weekly, if not a daily occurrence that someone makes a comment about my last name. Of course, it doesn't help that I'm an attorney, but it is often a frequent topic of conversation. I think that's why, and that's how I became interested in family history. I was always wondering how my name came about. How did it derive? I often joked with people that I descended from a horse thief. Of course, the more mundane and probably correct explanation of where Crook comes from is that often people believe that the Crook originally derived from people who were shepherds, and the name came from a shepherd's crook, or that people lived on the bend of a river or a road. It may surprise a lot of people that the Crook family name has actually been researched quite a lot. In fact, there are many histories that document thousands of names. However, our particular family and how it fit into those names has been a mystery for decades. You see, my grandfather was named James Jr. Crook, and he was transferred to Utah from Oklahoma in the Civilian Conservation Corps before World War II. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created in New Deal legislation in order to give work to unemployed single men who came from disadvantaged families. There was a location in Hooper, Utah where my grandfather was transferred to and worked. My grandfather's father was named James Crook, and his mother was Ida Mae Tullis. And my grandfather's grandfather was William Levi Crook, who was the son of Henry Crook. And for decades, that is all we knew. There was no indication of who Henry's father was and where Henry had come from. My earnest research into Henry Crook began 16 years ago, and it started because my grandfather, James Crook, passed away. I was close to my grandfather, and after his passing, I felt compelled to try to figure out how our family fit into the greater family histories of the other Crook families about which I knew. And so I began my family history search with what most people do, and that is to go to the census records that are available from that time. And so I began with census records in 1860, 1870, and 1880. And they all showed that Henry was born in Pennsylvania and that his wife Margaret was born in Indiana. The records also showed that Henry and Margaret's first 3 children were born in Indiana. Of course, based on that information, I brought in my search into Indiana. In doing so, I discovered that Henry Crook had volunteered to serve in the Mexican-American War in Putnam County, Indiana in 1846, and that he had actually served in the war for a year when he was mustered out of duty in 1847 in Louisiana. Additional research showed that he returned to Putnam County, Indiana in 1848 and married Margaret Jackson on April 13, 1848. At that point, however, the historical record turned cold. For years, I searched for a Henry Crook, born in Pennsylvania, in all of the census records of Pennsylvania and Indiana, but could find nothing. as the census and marriage records seemed to lead to nothing, I began to look in land records and discovered that there was a Crook family that owned property in Putnam County in 1840. The property owner's name was Frederick Crook, who had been granted a patent from the federal government in November of 1840. After discovering that patent, I went to the 1840 census and found that there was a Frederick Crook whose age was between 40 and 50 years old and who resided in Putnam County, Indiana, who had, it appeared, 5 sons between the ages of 5 and 20, 2 daughters under the age of 5, and a wife who was between 40 and 50 years old. For those of you who don't know, the 1840 census and those censuses before that time did not include the names of all of the family members. It was in 1850 that the censuses began to include the names of all family members, or actually all household members, within a house. However, in the 1850 census, I could find no Crook family. I was very discouraged by the lack of information in the 1850 census. I could find actually no Frederick Crook in any surrounding state that had any similarity to the Frederick Crook that was identified in the census record, and I couldn't find any Henry Crook in the 1850 census either. And so, knowing what I knew, and knowing what I knew about the land records, I took a different approach to trying to find him. Knowing that Frederick Crook had been between 40 and 50 years old when he received the patent from the United States government, I figured he must have come from another place. He must have moved from somewhere else. And knowing that Henry Crook had been born in Pennsylvania, Henry being one of his sons, I assumed that there must have been a Frederick Crook who lived in Pennsylvania. So I began doing research in the census data in Pennsylvania to try and find a Frederick Crook, and although there were Frederick Crooks that did appear in the Pennsylvania records, none of them matched in age or condition the Frederick Crook that had been identified in the Indiana census and the patent. So I did something else. I figured, well, if Frederick Crook is not showing up in the 1850 census, and I can't find him anywhere else, it's possible that he passed away between 1840 and 1850. And so I went to the LDS Family History Library, and I did a search of all of the probate records beginning from 1840, when he would have received the property, and I went all the way through 1860, believing that at some point they must have probated that record, or probated the estate of Frederick Crook if he had passed away. Unfortunately, nothing showed up. So then I had another idea, and that idea was, well, maybe because he had children, especially boys, who were between 15 and 20 years old, it was possible that they may have been getting married. So I went to the marriage records to see if I could find any marriage records that might show the names of the parents of anyone who might have been married with the last name of Crook. And obviously, I had found Henry Crook's marriage certificate. Well, in doing that search, the only name that showed up besides Henry's with the Crook spelling, C-R-O-O-K, was a woman named Margaret Crook, and that marriage was in 1842. And because the information that I derived from the 1840 census showed that Frederick Crook only had 2 young daughters, it didn't make sense that that Margaret Crook would in any way be related to Frederick. And that marriage certificate showed that this Margaret Crook had married a person named Isaac Davis. Well, remembering that when I had done the search for Henry Crook, that his marriage certificate and actually the marriage certificate that we have shows his name as Crooks, I expanded my search on marriage certificates to anyone with the name of Crooks. And in doing that, I was able to find the names of three different men. One was named Frederick Crooks, which I found to be interesting because if in fact Frederick Crook, there was another Frederick Crook, it's very possible that this Frederick Crooks could be the same Frederick Crook or it could be a son. I also found the name of a Samuel Crooks, and I also found the name of a Christiana Crooks. However, the Indiana registrar and the records of marriages do not record the names of the parents of people who are being married. And in fact, they don't even identify the age of the people who are marrying. So it wasn't very helpful. However, it did let me know that there were several Crooks who had been married besides Henry at that time, and that it is very possible that those people could have been related to the Frederick Crooks who had a number of children living with him in 1840. I also started doing research on the children of Henry Crook to see if in looking through their records I could discover any facts that might help in deriving where Henry Crook came from. So I began with his oldest child, who's named Abram in the census records. As I did research, I actually came to find out that Abram was also named Abraham, and in fact was probably named Abraham, but his name had been shortened to Abram, and that's how he was identified among his friends and family. In doing that research, I also found some other interesting things that will be the subject of a later episode of the Family Treehouse. But the most significant thing, and the thing that helped me and created a breakthrough in determining things about Henry Crook and his family, was that Abraham had died in Oregon. And in the records of the funeral home where Abraham had passed away, the person who had given the information to the funeral home disclosed that Henry had been born in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. Strasburg, Pennsylvania, I should say, is located in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And this was the first clue that we ever had about the exact location in Pennsylvania where the father of Henry Crook, or where Henry Crook actually had lived. And I was so excited. So I went to the Pennsylvania records and I went to the Lancaster County records to see if I could identify any Frederick Crook, any Henry Crook, any Abraham Crook that had lived in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. Interestingly, Strasburg, Pennsylvania is in Lancaster County, which is Amish country. It's also where many Mennonites and other Germans actually came and settled in the early days of the founding of the country. So I went to those records, and the records actually were pretty good. But in doing this search, I was not able to find any Frederick Crook, but I stumbled upon the name of a Valentine Crook. And that was very helpful because Valentine's an unusual name, or so I thought. And so I thought, well, this would be an easy way to see if I could find any other crooks. If there's a Valentine Crook, it's likely that I will be able to find information about him. And as I did that, the books that I was looking at that had historical information, that had census information, were done periodically. And what I discovered as I looked for Valentine Crook in other books, that he didn't show up. And so I just started looking for Valentine, and as I did so, Valentine Krug appeared, Krug. And doing a little research, I discovered that in fact, Valentine Crook, Crook, and Valentine Krug, Krug, were the same person. And that gave me an idea. Perhaps Crook, the Crook family that we came from, actually came from a Germanic name, Krug. And I began searching for Frederick Krugs in Pennsylvania, in Indiana, to see if perhaps that's why we couldn't find any information. I also began looking for information on Henry Crook, K-R-U-G, sorry. As I did that, and as I began to search for Frederick K-R-U-G, I kept getting referred to a book entitled Descendants of Frederick Krug and Elizabeth Hare of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And in doing that, I also learned that the LDS Family History Library had a copy of that book. And I noted that the next time I wanted to go to the Family History Library, that I needed to go and look at that book. Perhaps it would have information, I thought, that would lead me to discover the names of Henry Crook's father. And perhaps I clearly identify whether Frederick Crook and Henry Crook were related. I was very excited about this discovery, and as I continued to do research on Ancestry.com, and as I did research on FamilySearch.org, and as I did independent searches on the internet to see if I could find any information, it dawned on me that although I had been to the Family History Library and I had been looking at the probate records, I had never looked at the land records that of Putnam County, Indiana. And I just never had thought about, well, just go and look at the land records rather than the probate records, because I believed that they would show up in the probate records, but I hadn't thought about looking at the land records. So as I was thinking about this, I went to my church on a Friday evening. The elders quorum in my ward had actually determined to do a family history night where they would get together and provide any assistance that we needed in doing our family history. I thought that was a good thing to do, and so I went over there with my wife, and as we sat down and we did some search, I thought maybe somebody would have some more help for me or information that they could give me in leading me to something. I kept getting the feeling that I just needed to go to the Family History Library. And in fact, it was so persistent that I told one of the people that I was talking to, who also had to do some research, and said, I really think I should just go to the library. Should we go together sometime? And he said, yeah, that would be a great idea. Well, I went home that night. I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning and immediately just felt that I needed to go to the Family History Library. In fact, it was such a strong feeling that, and I had woken up a little bit early, that I woke up Laura, my wife, and I said, Laura, I really think I should go to the library. She said, yeah, I feel like you should too. And so I just got up, and I went to the library. So when I went to the library, I decided that I would start with the land records, and then when I got done with the land records, I would go and look at the book about Frederick Krug that I had been referred to a number of times in my research. And so that's what I did. I went to the land records. I had, before I had gone, I had printed out all of the microfilm films and the locations, and in doing that, I just started from 1840, and I went through the films, and I looked for anyone named Crook or Krug in those films. And as I did, I went through the first row, nothing. Second row, nothing. Third row, nothing. Fourth row, nothing. Fifth row, nothing. Sixth row, nothing. Seventh row, nothing. I started on the 8th row, and as I did, I just got this strong impression that I needed to go back to the 7th row, that I hadn't gone all the way to the end of the 7th row. So I finished the 8th row, and I went back to the 7th. I went to the end, and when I got to the end of the 7th row, this is what I saw. I saw a list of several deeds with the name of Crook, including a Frederick Crook. And I went to I found the documents, and this is what I found. The first deed blew me away. Why does it blow me away? Well, first, it identifies the property at issue, the property of the deed, as the same property that is the property of the patent that was given to Frederick Crook in 1840. So we are talking about the same piece of property. Second, the deed identifies a woman named Margaret Myers, married to a Samuel Myers, and she conveyed her dower interest as the widow of Frederick Crook. Well, what does that mean? As a lawyer, that means a lot to me. To people who are not familiar with the law, it may not mean as much, but to me, it means everything. It means a dower interest is a common law interest that entitled a widow to a portion of her deceased husband's estate, which means that she, Margaret Myers, had been married to Frederick Crook, and she obviously remarried to Samuel Myers. So I know now the name of the woman who was married to Frederick Crook. And I also know that Frederick Crook had died before the date of this deed. Third, it identifies that Frederick and Margaret Crook had a son named Frederick who inherited a 1/5 interest in the property. What does that tell us? Well, it tells us that at the time of Frederick's death, he had 5 heirs. We know one of them was Margaret, because she had a dower interest. And now we know that one is named Frederick. Frederick is his son. Well, when I turned the next page, I found another deed that involved the same property. In this deed, There's a deed from Samuel Crook with his wife Elizabeth Crook, and Jackson Scarberry and his wife Christiana, who have together 2/5 of an interest in the same property that was owned by Frederick Crook. Well, if you'll recall, my earlier research into the marriage records showed that there had been a Samuel Crook, and in fact, that Samuel Crooks, and he had married a woman named Elizabeth Scarberry. So now we have Samuel Crook and Elizabeth Crook. So these are the same folks who've been married. And we have a Jackson Scarberry and his wife Christiana. And you'll remember in my earlier research that there had been a Christiana Crook who had married actually a Columbus Scarberry. Inferences would suggest that either Columbus Scarberry went by Jackson, or there was a Jackson Scarberry who went by Columbus. It's probably Columbus that went by Jackson, which will be the topic of another episode that I'm going to do. But also it says that they have a 2/5 interest. That means Samuel and Christiana are the heirs of Frederick Crook, and each got 1/5 interest. So what do we have? Well, the deed now shows, together with the other deed, show that we have 4/5 of the interest in the property. Also is fascinating is that the 2/5 interest is being deeded to Henry C. Crook. It doesn't, there's no deed to any spouse of Henry Crook, but it is being deeded to Henry C. Crook. Then there is a third deed, and that's from Henry Crook and Margaret Crook, conveying 3/5 of an interest in the same property. This tells us that Henry Crook was the 5th heir, because now he has conveyed 3/5 of an interest. He got the other 2/5 from his brother Samuel and his sister Christiana. They conveyed that to him, and now he is conveying their interest plus his interest to another person. These documents prove everything. They prove that Frederick was married to a Margaret, who remarried to a Samuel Myers. They prove that Frederick and Margaret had 4 children at the time of Frederick's death, which occurred before 1856. And those 4 children were Frederick, Samuel, Henry, and Christiana. And it also shows that all but Frederick were married at the time. And it identifies the spouses of each of those siblings. When I saw that record, and I saw those records and I read them, I was in awe. The feeling that came over me of gratitude, and I knew that I had been led to find these records that finally established who Henry Crook's father was and who his siblings were. I was so grateful, and I had been looking for that information at that time for 14 years. And I was just so humbled and felt so grateful that I could find that information. So after discovering that information, and after making sure that I had secured the copies, I decided that I would go and find the book that I had been kept being referred to. Because even though now I knew that Henry Crook's father was Frederick Crook, I still didn't know where Frederick Crook had come from. Now remember, for 14 years I had still been looking for that information and still was coming up empty. And so I decided I should go and find that book, which I did. I went, I got the book, and I went to the table. I actually picked up another book as well that also had some information about Crook families, and I opened the book and I began reading it. And as I read, it came to a listing of Frederick Krug's children. And as I found, as I looked at that page, it showed a list of those kids. And one name that stood out was a child named Frederick. And Frederick had been married to a woman named Margaret Grimes. And Frederick was born about 1800. And in the book it says that the last sighting that they have of Frederick Krug predated 1840. In fact, it had been in the late 1820s. All of that information was consistent with the information I had discovered about Frederick Crook. Remember, the 1840 census information in Indiana showed that Frederick Crook was between the ages of 40 and 50 years old. It showed that Frederick Crook had purchased property in 1840 in Indiana. It seemed to suggest, and now I knew that Frederick Crook had been married to a woman named Margaret. The information was stunning to me. But even more shocking to me was this information. Look underneath Frederick's name. That's right. There's the name of Samuel Myers and Christiana Myers. Well, why was that shocking to me? Because remember that Margaret Crook, Frederick Crook's wife, had remarried to a man named Samuel Myers. That seemed really odd to me that I would find this information. So I immediately checked the census records. And in 1840, you will notice that right below the census name for Frederick Crook is a man named Samuel Myers. I was even more shocked. So then I went and looked at the patents, and Samuel Myers had purchased and received the property patent to a property neighboring Frederick Crook the exact same day that Frederick Crook received his patent. It seemed awfully coincidental to me. Then I looked in the 1850 census records. And the 1850 census records show that Samuel Myers' wife was named Christiana. The same name as Samuel Myers' wife, who is Frederick Crook's sister. And even more significantly, 1850 census records show that Samuel Myers was born in Pennsylvania, that Christiana was born in Pennsylvania, and you notice that the book about the Frederick Crook shows that Samuel Myers and Christiana Krug were married in Montgomery, Ohio. Their oldest children were born in Ohio. I could not believe the coincidence. But what was striking to me is, well, could there be another Samuel Myers? Of course, there's a possibility that Margaret actually married another man named Samuel Myers, but I went and I looked at additional information and discovered that Christiana Myers had actually died April 10th, 1853. This was 3 years before this was 3 years before the deeds were signed that showed Samuel Myers uh, and Margaret Myers were married. So then I went, and thought, well, the marriage records would show a marriage between, it should show a marriage between Samuel Myers and Margaret Crook if, in fact, this is the same person. When I looked up the marriages, though, I discovered that Samuel Myers had, in fact, married a person named Margaret Davis in March of 1856. And remember, as I discussed earlier, that there had been a Margaret Crook who had married an Isaac Davis in 1842. The very marriage record that I had dismissed because I didn't believe that this could be the marriage of anyone related to Frederick because he didn't have any children who were old enough. So, in one day, on March 22nd, 2014, I found out 4 remarkable things. Number 1, I found the names of the father, the mother, the brothers, and the sister of Henry Crook. 2, I found the 2 lost children of Frederick Krug. 3, I found out that our family descends from Germans named Krug, not from Irish or Scottish families named Crook. And 4, I guess it's fair to say that I found Frederick's hiding place. But most of all, the most important thing that I learned from this experience is that the hand of God is in our family history. He cares about us. He cares about our fathers. He cares about our grandfathers and our grandmothers, and He wants our hearts to be turned to them, and He wants us to know and find and discover them. I also learned that sometimes you have to be patient. It was important that it take me a long time before I found all the information, and that is because I would not have been able to recognize or identify that the fact that Margaret Crook had married Samuel Myers had greater significance. And it was important that I find the deed showing that Margaret Myers was the widow of Frederick Crook and that she was married to Samuel Myers before I look at the book involving the descendants of Frederick Krug and Elizabeth Hare. Without having first looked at that, the significance of her marrying Samuel Myers would have been lost on me. Additionally, I wouldn't have been struck to go back and look to see if perhaps this Samuel Myers that Margaret had married had some relationship to the Samuel Myers that had been identified in the book with Frederick Krug's heirs. I am so grateful that I had the opportunity to feel the hand of God and to know that I was guided in finding this information. Thanks for watching. If you'd like the backup and source documents for this information, I've placed that all on familysearch.org. And if you're a direct descendant of the Crook family, you'll be able to get all of that information. Currently, I have not placed all of the information on Ancestry.com, but anticipate doing that shortly. If you'd like additional information, also please contact me directly, and I'll get you that information as I have it. Please join me for future episodes in which I will discuss additional interesting family history facts that are related to my family. I really appreciate you watching, and the next episode will involve the close link between the Myers family and the Crook family through generations. Can't wait to see you next time. Thanks.